let's get the shoe on the road, the show on the road, or whatever that expression is. So welcome everybody to the First Coast Free Thought Society Zoom room. The First Coast Free Thought Society is an organization of individuals who prefer science and reason over religious dogma and fanaticism. We've enjoyed the non-religious community of Northeast Florida and beyond since 1998. We're now in our 25th year, and we are also the proud Jacksonville chapter of the American Humanist Association. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Meetup, Instagram, and YouTube. We meet socially through our secular Sunday gatherings in the park and our book and movie discussion groups. And then there's the Free Thinker newsletter, to which we invite your readership, your feedback, and your submissions. You may learn more at our website, fcfs.org. Now, I do have a question. I ask this question every time. It's a question for the floor. Is anyone here new to the First Coast Free Thought Society? If so, may I ask, how did you learn of us? Are you new? And if you're willing to share, let me know. If this is a good time to unmute yourselves if you want to speak. If not, no harm, no foul. But I am interested in how you might have heard about us. Show of hands, anybody care to speak? Clayton, go ahead, Clayton.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I was searching the meetup groups, I think for mainly secular related organizations, and you guys popped up, so I decided to join.
Oh, thank you, Clayton.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you're with us. Anybody else care to share if you're new, and how did you hear about us?
I'm not new, but I haven't joined you guys for quite some time, so it's nice to be able to take part in the programming again.
Well, welcome back if you haven't been with us for quite some time. I'm glad you're back with us. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else new to us? I see a lot of familiar faces, so maybe there is no one else. But if you are, okay, hearing none, I'll move on. I appreciate that. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. We are all volunteers here, yet we incur expenses, largely promotion. We're promoted online, on the radio, and in print. If you know of a viable place for us to promote, please share it with us. We also have some associated costs for our website and fees for regulatory compliance as a 501c3 charitable organization. So if you can see your way clear to offer a membership donation of $20, $50, or any dollar amount, you'll be part of the reason we're able to continue our public outreach. We're tremendously grateful for all who have become members and made donations. We need you, and we appreciate you. We would also like to inquire about your interest in becoming a member of the Board of Directors for 2024. The board is responsible for the operations and direction of the First Coast Free Thought Society. We meet via Zoom 4 times each year. A director's term is 1 year. If you have interest, please contact our nominating chair, David Schwamberd. David Schwamberd's email address we'll put in the chat. Maybe Madeline can do that. It's dschwam@unf.edu. And he will then offer more details. We look forward to a provocative lineup of exciting speakers in the coming months. Next month, October 15th, Dr. Nick Seabrook, political science professor and public administration chair at UNF, will discuss his new book, One Person, One Vote, A Surprising History of Gerrymandering in America. Then in November, we have Mark Potak, formerly of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And he is an expert on racism and hate groups, and he'll discuss far-right hate groups and anti-Semitism. Then in December, we'll meet in person at a local Jacksonville restaurant, which we were going to announce in the next month or the month after, for our annual Human Light celebration. Then in January 2024, we'll begin the year with our 3rd Free Thought for All. No speaker, no holds barred, no topic off limits, just us to discuss whatever comes to mind. We have several guests tentatively lined up for 2024, including Florida State Representative for District 13, Angie Nixon. So sign on to our meetup page, sign up for our newsletter and email announcements, stay in touch. You can do all of this through our website. Now this coming Saturday, September 23rd, at Miller's Ale House on Hodges and Beach Boulevard, we'll gather on the patio at 6:30 p.m. for some beer and some chit-chat. Happens to be the night of the autumnal equinox. Hope to see you there this Saturday at Miller's Ale House. Now tonight, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Erich Freiberger, professor of philosophy and public policy at Jacksonville University, where he has taught since 1998. His presentation tonight is titled How We Misunderstand Liberty. His scholarly work stems from a long-standing interest in the relationship between psychoanalysis and Socratic ethics. He has published many articles. His work has appeared in publications all around the globe. In fact, Erich just returned from England, where he presented a recent paper titled Hamlet and Plato's Ship of Fools. Dr. Freiberger sits on the Ethics Commission of the City of Jacksonville, as well as the Ethics Board of Community Hospice in Jacksonville. And if that's not enough, Dr. Freiberger may be seen as a wise, middle-aged sage who offers some comic relief in the documentary To Be an American. Now, please use the Zoom hand raise feature found at the reactions button. Raise your hand during the Q&A. The hand raise feature is in the reactions button. We'll be looking for that. Should you prefer, you may message a question via the Zoom chat feature. Let's mute the mic until it's time to speak. Please know we are recording the presentation for posterity. A side note, we don't know what might be said during our discussions. We're open to the public. Sometimes we cringe, and sometimes we nod in quiet approval, and sometimes we cheer. But now let's begin by appreciating Erich's graciously offering us his time, his expertise, and his insights about why we misunderstand liberty. So Erich, we are all yours.
Well, thank you, Ken. First of all, I want to thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've spoken before the Free Thought Society quite a few times, but it's been many years, I think over 10 or maybe even 15 years since I've spoken to this wonderful group. I've always enjoyed it. You guys have always given me a warm welcome. And what I'm going to do tonight is talk about some thoughts that I've had about the way we think about liberty, which is a concept which has been thrown around a lot of late. I teach ethics and public policy in the Masters of Public Policy program at Jacksonville University. And teaching that for the last 10 years has really kind of provoked me to think a little bit about the origins of some of our current political dilemmas. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. I do want to warn you, however, I'm a philosopher, and the custom in my discipline is not to use fancy slideshows and PowerPoints and that sort of thing. So I have nothing. You're going to be looking at a talking head tonight. Hopefully I'll keep it interesting, and we will have a lively Q&A, as I always know that this group does. So I'm really looking forward to that, especially given that David Schwamberg apparently has laryngitis. It might mean I'm safe. So let me just launch into my talk here, my random thoughts, if you will, on liberty. There's a long-standing tension in our politics between the rights of property on the one hand and democratic equality and the rights of the community on the other. It is clear which side appears to be winning, and this presents a problem. Our political and economic insistence on the supremacy of individual rights, whether individual or corporate, has led us to neglect any perspective that tries to speak about the common good. As a result, the dominant concept of liberty today is a negative one that emphasizes the supremacy of individual rights over the rights of the community. We see this clearly in the case of those who objected to mask and vaccine mandates in the name of liberty during the pandemic. The ancient Greeks had a word for this: idiocy. In Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, the word idiotes, or idiot, refers to one who is only concerned with his own private interest. Sadly, since the advent of neoliberalism in the late 1970s, our entire economy has come to be understood as founded on the idea that we should only look out for our private interests. This is the neoliberal gospel. The Chicago School economist Milton Friedman spent an entire career promoting this libertarian notion that individual choice, the individual's freedom to choose, will always promote a better social result than planning or regulation of any kind, which attempts to look out for the common good. On this view, all claims to identify the common good are nothing more than disguised statements of individual preference or self-interest. Thus, he argues, bureaucratic planners mouth such phrases to maximize their power and to ensure their future employment in a perpetually expanding administrative state. This anti-Keynesian philosophy holds that the unregulated market, free of the shackles of state control, will always provide the ultimate solution to any social problem. This means that coordinated government action and regulation of trade constitute an unwarranted distortion of market efficiency. Taxes should be low or non-existent. Government should be small and its programs should be austere. Regulation should be eliminated and as many government functions as possible should be privatized because private industry is always more efficient. So goes the neoliberal hymn. It is nonsense, of course, but this discordant music has shaped every aspect of the modern American landscape, from our economics to the look of the businesses and shopping malls that line our highways, to the dysfunction of our politics. In short, this neoliberal dogma has shaped what America is today. Now, I recently came back to the US after a 3-month sabbatical in Greece this spring. I was there to study Greek and visit the various sites associated with the history of Greek philosophy, which I've been teaching for the last 30 years. But I somehow never made it to Greece until my research interest shifted. I've been writing on Plato's influence on Shakespeare, and suddenly the study of Greek became vitally essential to my research. So I'm doing what I should have done 40 years ago and learning Greek. But the point I want to make tonight is that upon my return, I was struck by how different the American landscape is from that of Greece. In Greece, you see towns and villages that have been inhabited for millennia that are clearly demarcated from the surrounding farmland and countryside. Beautiful seaside landscapes, virtually untouched by development. A relative absence of urban sprawl in all but the largest cities, a countryside composed of discrete villages that have been inhabited for centuries, if not millennia. Now contrast that with Florida, where almost the entire coastline is marred by sprawl and overdevelopment. In Daytona Beach, the high-rises are built so close to the beach that many are dangerously close to being undermined after last year's hurricane. And when you drive down the interstate, what do you see? A landscape shaped by and for large national businesses. McDonald's, Buc-ee's, Wendy's, the national gas chains, and new development everywhere. There's no question that these businesses provide a service Americans are clearly willing to pay for. But given their ubiquity and dominance, it's as if these private interests had purchased grazing rights on the rest of us at the expense of any alternative conception of the common good. The best we seem to be able to do as a nation is to claim that the free market must rule at any cost. Anything less is anathema to the neoliberal dogma. It even seems to be our government's slogan, Florida is open for business. In its race to the bottom, business-friendly tax laws are designed to encourage growth that is as rapid as possible, regardless of the social cost or the effect on our civic community. The quality of the development is never assessed because growth of any kind is always deemed as positive to the extent it contributes a net gain to the economy. Now, this is truly a race to the bottom in at least two ways. By encouraging business to move to a low-tax state, this growth occurs at the expense of other states. But second, more importantly, it also fails to assess the quality of the growth it so proudly extols, because it is decided in advance that all economic growth of any kind is always a net positive. And thus it fails to ask the question of whether it serves the public interest or furthers the common good. But does all growth always serve the common good? Does, for example, the emerging sprawl southwest of Nocatee serve the common good, or does it serve the private interest of developers? Now, I don't know for sure, but too few of us pause to ask such questions. In fact, to even raise them is heresy enough to get you branded as a socialist. One could argue that such development encourages long, energy-inefficient commutes at a time when our common interest quite plausibly demands that we cut back on carbon emissions and take a host of other measures to slow down anthropogenic climate change. The most pressing question of our time is whether the market can respond to such long-term assessments of our common interest. Economists often respond to such concerns with vague talk about how future costs are discounted in light of present preferences. But in general, such big questions tend to be dismissed out of hand on ideological grounds because our devotion to the unquestionable bond between individual interest and economic growth. So in the face of this environmental crisis, we continue to contribute to the problem. Private interest profit, and not much changes. Now, as my training is in the history of philosophy, I'd like to briefly consider the origin of this insistence on the supremacy of individual rights in political theory and economics. The assumption that rational self-interest is a source of political freedom and economic growth stems from the origin of social contract theory and classical economics. Most of all, it stems from Thomas Hobbes and Adam Smith's assumption that individual interest is at the center of everything we do. No doubt self-interest is essential. The problem is that in such economistic thinking, we are too often confronted with a single version of assessing that interest that fails to imagine any value more worthy than mere survival or economic growth. In short, in political theory, it leads to a reduction of the ancient question about the best way to live, and it reduces it to the answer to that question by saying that there's nothing better than living securely. This reduces the good life to mere life. It effectively reduces the ancient search for the best life of the community to an exhibition that shows how well the community has met the conditions for survival or mere life. In economic theory, it makes efficiency through the division of labor into an end in itself, and this end effectively silences almost every other. This is a bit of a tangent, but it reminds me of going to a supermarket where you have 20 different versions of pasta sauce. So you have freedom of choice, right? But in the end, it's all pasta sauce. If you happen to want something the store doesn't stock, well, then you're out of luck. In the same way, if you move to Jacksonville, you're free to find housing anywhere you like. But if you want good, affordable housing and good schools for your kids, but you don't want to commute from Clay County, or if you're a young person trying to buy a house today, you're also out of luck. In other words, your choice is free, provided you're willing to take what private interest is prepared for you without your input. In brief, the market always responds to past concerns. It's always a step behind responding to last quarter's problem, and it's very bad at anticipating future needs in a changing world. I'd like to quote from the Pulitzer Prize winner Hernan Diaz's recent novel, Trust, which was published in 2022. This quote sums up the problems of this perspective and how it's connected with self-interest. And I quote, "A nation's prosperity is based on nothing but a multitude of egoisms aligning until they resemble what is called the common good. Get enough selfish individuals to converge and act in the same direction, and the result looks very much like a collective will or common cause. But once this illusory public interest is at work, people forget an all-important distinction. That my needs, desires, and cravings may mirror yours does not mean we have a shared goal. It means that we have the same goal. This is a crucial difference. I will only cooperate with you as long as it serves me. Beyond that, there can only be rivalry or indifference." The character speaking here runs an investment firm that precipitated the 1929 stock market crash in the novel, and he profited heavily from it. Notice that he does not say the convergence of interest is the common good. He merely says that they resemble it. We might temporarily have the same goals as when I pull off at Buc-ee's to refill my fuel tank because it is the cheapest fuel available. We all want cheap gas. But because we're self-seeking, we do not really have a shared goal that we have worked out together in any meaningful political way. At bottom, there's no real agreement here, because the social contract thinking, which forms the foundation of this concept of political and economic self-interest, excludes that possibility from the outset. Its primary assumption is that we all have different and conflicting desires that rarely, if ever, align. Where ancient political thought begins with the prospect of discovering grounds for common agreement in our common political nature, the social contract theory, which is the basis of modern political and economic thought, starts with the notion that we naturally disagree about everything. Law is simply a conventional construction by which we agree to disagree to maintain social peace. Thus, from the outset, it surrenders any notion of what is ideally best and says it is impossible to find it. Instead, it substitutes the idea of law as a compromise that forestalls conflict. In this transformation and substitution of the ancient view, competing visions of self-interest are not neutralized. Instead, the capacity to satisfy our selfish interest and the industry to do so become the sole means of assessing what we hold in common. Thus, the nation's gross domestic product becomes a dominant measure of economic and political success, because it is assumed in advance that economic self-interest is the only thing we hold in common. When agreement is deemed impossible, the health of the economy becomes the lowest common denominator. And I'm certain you'll recall another recent version of this neoliberal ideology. In one of Donald Trump's televised debates with Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential race, he said it was his duty to pay as little tax as possible. This is precisely the idiocy described in Pericles' funeral oration, and it leaves no space at all for promoting the common good. For if the wealthiest among us aren't willing to pay their fair share, why should the rest of us play by the rules? This kind of approach is as pernicious as it is dangerous. It is radically corrosive to any vision of social unity. The world this outlook is built is one which systematically neglects the common good in favor of private interest and individual property rights. In response to such attitudes, the longtime head of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, has recently published a book entitled The Bill of Obligations, because the insistent drumbeat that identifies liberty with the primacy of individual rights is tearing the social fabric of this country apart, making it impossible to bind the many into one. One might well ask, what happened to the notion of duty to the nation? Now notice that this neoliberal ideology also effectively removes any need for public policy or government action of any kind, because according to this perspective, such action is unnecessary because the public good will always be best served by an unregulated private interest. The magic of the market will magically solve every problem. And indeed, for the last 40 to 50 years, Republican libertarians have tried to dismantle the effectiveness and scope of government. This, I will argue, is a travesty of the view of the three conservative thinkers who are frequently quoted in support of such policies: Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, and the famous skeptic David Hume. I maintain that contemporary so-called conservatives actually espouse views that are anathema to each of these thinkers. Smith argues that no one trades for the public interest, but this is a far cry from saying government has no role in establishing a level playing field and regulating public safety. To read him as the advocate of free markets, or markets free of any governmental regulation, is a severe oversimplification. Edmund Burke is frequently cited as a father and prototype of modern conservatism for his anti-revolutionary stance and his praise of traditional forms of government. Burke argues for preserving the status quo against radical change based on the metaphysical and theoretical ideas that animated the French Revolution. He's talking about Rousseau, Locke, and social contract theory. But in stark contrast to this, contemporary conservatives appear also to want to dismantle the status quo in favor of an equally metaphysical and wholly mythical vision of a supposed free market past. This is actually anathema to Burke's vision of continuity with tradition. Burke is no radical, but conservatives who want to shut down the government and are willing to default on the national debt to do so, do show themselves to be advocates of radical change in a way that is in stark contrast to Burke's advocacy for continuity with tradition. David Hume is a no-nonsense skeptic who, like Burke, has no time for the mythical constructions of social contract theory. Like Burke, he was a harsh critic of what he called the metaphysical thinkers of the Enlightenment and the social contract theory tradition, who rely on abstract constructions of consent rather than appeals to traditional political structures to explain why we should obey the sovereign power, the state. And this brings me to my main point. Hume is right. Such constructions are mythical and metaphysical abstractions, whether they're constructions of social contract theory or the economist idealized construction of a perfectly functioning, frictionless free market. And because these are fictional constructs, this means that the Republican rejection of the New Deal consensus is not actually conservative. I'm referring to the attacks on Social Security, the work requirements for food stamps, et cetera. I mean, you're familiar with all this. These policies are not, in fact, conservative in Burke's or Hume's sense. Instead, there's an inversion of values at work here. When conservatives reject such policies and seek to undo programs like welfare and, more recently, Obamacare, they do so in the name of a mythical metaphysical ideal of a perfect 19th century economic liberalism. And when they do this, they too are involved in a metaphysical critique of present values in the name of an idealized past that never actually existed. Just as social contract theorists, from Hobbes to Locke and Rousseau, invent a mythical state of nature from which they magically derive a set of inalienable rights. Now, such thought experiments can be really useful, but we must always bear in mind their experimental character, as they don't always explain things as fully as they claim. And this, I think, is a problem with liberalism as a theory of the state. It has the theory is missing a few things. Now, I don't presume to be able to tell you how to fill those gaps. But I just want to point out that the gaps are there and they're problematic, and they apply just as well to contemporary conservatism as they do to contemporary progressive politics. Now, my beef here is not with the idea of individual rights, but with the assertion that they always take precedence over community rights. Consider how in Florida, the insistence on individual rights has become the foundation of attacks on any number of programs that promote democratic equality and inclusion, from DEI programs to the anti-woke and the Don't Say Gay bills, and even in the attempts to limit voting rights and ultimately also the right to protest. The justification provided for these restrictions is that they are needed to protect the rights of others from wokeism, trans people, disruptive protesters, and fraudulent voters, and the like. This protection is, of course, highly selective. I'd like to know, for example, why the state wasn't protecting my right not to get infected from all those idiots who refused to wear masks and get vaccinated when the pandemic was at its peak. Why were just these rights protected instead of the rights of the people they put at risk? There's a tendency to promote rights which attach to individuals while ignoring those that benefit the community by relieving shared burdens. But the determination of which threat should be defended against here is, of course, inconsistent. Other than our governor's ideological preference for one and his disdain for the other, I'm not sure there's a logical difference between protecting citizens from wokeism and protecting citizens from COVID-19 through mask and vaccine mandates. The difference, of course, is that one is an imaginary harm feared by a portion of the population who object to such policies because they limit their individual freedom, while the risk of infection and death during a pandemic is a real risk suffered by everyone, and thus actions which seek to prevent it provide a benefit common to all. So when the state legislature starts passing such ideologically driven initiatives, one might ask, who are the real conservatives here? The ones who preserve things as they are, or the ones who seek to overturn them in the name of an idealized conception of the past? I mean, haven't we always had vaccine mandates in public schools? Are we to expect that these two are to be overturned because of this radical embrace of individual rights? Will every individual be free to decide whether her child gets vaccinated? Now, this might please the Moms for Liberty, but it would be a disaster for public health. What I like to suggest is that both so-called conservatism and progressivism, which in contemporary parlance I think is misnamed as liberalism, are the product of an idealized liberal tradition that begins with social contract theory. Progressives appeal to an idealized conception of equality from the hypothesis of a mythical state of nature. Conservatism appeals to an equally idealized conception of a primacy of individual property rights in a perfectly free market that harks back to the primitive acquisition of property in Locke's state of nature, a formulation which forms the backbone of modern libertarian thought. Both of these views originate in the liberal view of the social contract theory's conception of the state of nature, which holds that government will inevitably be produced by the confluence of enlightened self-interest. Now, contrary to Burke and Hume, it is simply not the case that one of these views is driven by ideological premises and the other depends on some kind of pre-existent conservative past to which we must return. Rather, both views of this mythic past are grounded in ideology. They're fictions. And both are the historical product of social contract theory and the emerging market capitalism of the 17th century. Thus, if it is misleading to call progressives liberals, it is no less misleading to call those on the right side of the aisle conservative, when they systematically reject the conservative principles of stability and continuity, which their intellectual forebears espouse. And this is even more true in a time when the Republican Party has veered away from economic conservatism towards Trumpian populism. Now here, I'd like to emphasize Hernan Diaz's point from his novel Trust that I raised earlier. Though markets create the semblance of common agreement, this appearance of common cause is illusory. To temporarily share the same goal is not the same thing as having a shared goal. For the point of departure for the liberal theory that advocates the supremacy of individual rights is that agreement on shared goals is basically impossible. That's why we need social contract theory to begin with. This theory begins, therefore, in a kind of despair at the possibility of any kind of agreement about such goals. Indeed, it is only because rights often conflict that they need to be explicitly stated and protected in the first place. Because we cannot in principle agree about the common ends and purposes, the only agreement about ends and purposes that can be sustained is one that devolves into the least common denominator of measurable wealth and GDP. Rather than constructing an agreement about the conditions of human flourishing, this metric only provides an assessment of the degree to which production meets the conditions of survival. And of course, it says nothing about the distribution of that product. And this is not really enough to sustain our common political life. Okay. What actually sustains that political life is the shared social values of trust and decency, which form the foundation that upholds both markets and the peaceful transition of power in a properly functioning democracy. The problem with radical self-interest is that it ranks individual rights over the rights of the community. And this steadily corrodes and undermines the norms of trust and decency that sustain both our markets and our politics. The vital importance of these norms has been insufficiently acknowledged by economic and political theory. In the attempt to make self-interest the sole explanatory principle, theory has had difficulty grasping the externalities that it fails to take into account. One of the most important of those externalities, I think, is precisely the erosion of trust that comes through subjecting everything to market principles and self-interest. Now, social contract theory and classical economics agree to this extent. Social contract theory begins from our inability to agree amidst the diversity of perspectives. Classical economics begins from a diversity of economic activity. In both cases, this diversity is said to produce a kind of agreement through the pursuit of self-interest. But this agreement is only temporary, or in the novelist words, it's a semblance. What continues beneath its veneer and temporary facade is the opposition of interests, which these theories were designed to show is somehow reconciled. Now, I apologize for the excessively philosophical tenor of my approach. We can call it my professional deformation. It's the way I'm trained. And I really can't help myself, so I'm sorry about that. Now, some of you might be wondering now about libertarianism. Is it really as bad as I say? I mean, after all, it's an attractive philosophy for its simplicity. Its conception of the absolute character of property rights appears to be intuitive and straightforward, but it too is a product of the metaphysical abstractions of social contract theory. It begins with Locke's conception of the state of nature, in which we acquire property rights when we take what we need out of the commons of nature. And we make that commons, the things in that commons, our own through the addition of our labor. In this natural condition, Locke argues, we have a right to appropriate what we need out of the commons of nature to the extent that we can use it without wasting it. That is, without depriving others of its use. Once market society exists, however, we are free to trade perishable goods of agricultural production for the non-perishable goods valued by social convention. Once money and trade exist, we're free to trade perishable goods for gold or diamonds or any other socially recognized store of value. And we can do so to an unlimited degree without concern for the natural limitation of wastage that applies in the state of nature. This is the origin of the libertarian conception of property. And it too rests on a fictional thought experiment that blurs a distinction between the primitive acquisition of property right, state of nature, and it carries over its simple model to the present state of things in civil society. Now, at the risk of offending any libertarians among you, I tend to think that libertarians are kind of like house cats. They fiercely cling to their belief in their absolute independence, while having no understanding of the complex system upon which their survival actually depends. According to libertarian theory, we have a right to whatever we take from the state of nature through our labor, and anything that limits this right is theft or even slavery, which is the way libertarians often talk about taxation. Thus, for libertarians, taxation is regarded as theft. But this, of course, depends on a completely fictitious conception of affairs because we don't actually live in a state of nature. The absolute possession of property that Locke thinks originates in the state of nature is imagined to persist through the creation of markets that recognize the commensurability of perishable and durable goods. This radical development from nature to a state of trade is regarded as something natural by law. But trade depends upon an agreement and is thus actually something conventional. Accordingly, libertarians fail to recognize that this transition from nature to markets depends entirely on a state of civil trust guaranteed by the authority of governmental power, which is a conventional construction. Now, libertarians insist otherwise. They say markets are prior to government and are natural. They argue that this governmental role in guaranteeing the peace and security of markets is not necessary in the state of nature, and nothing more than a minimal state is required now because people can police markets on their own, is basically the argument. People can trade among themselves in an unregulated, free, and natural market that will develop mechanisms to police itself. But this is a fantasy. There is no such thing as a natural market. This is made clear in the history of social contract theory. In opposition to Locke, Hobbes had earlier argued that force and fraud would be the chief virtues in the state of nature, and without the threat of governmental enforcement and reprisals for violating the rules, markets and trade could not exist at all. Thus, for Hobbes, stable government with the power to coerce is the foundation of the trust that markets require to function. So which view is more utopian? The Lockean idealism that underlies the libertarian fantasy that all market exchanges occur in some sort of state of nature? Or the Hobbesian realism that asserts that markets require the threat of coercive force to preserve the fairness and security upon which they depend? Libertarianism seems to want to have it both ways. It wants the freedom and radical independence of Hobbes' state of nature, without the limitation on that freedom which the institution of the sovereign state requires. Now, there's no doubt that many exchanges can be entirely voluntary, and they depend only on the advantage to be gained by the two participants in the exchange. But to assert that they are always voluntary and that self-policing markets will keep force and fraud within acceptable limits is manifestly idealistic to an extraordinary degree. What I'm suggesting is that markets are not prior to government, but rather government and societal power and norms are required to create and sustain the trust which permits markets to function at all. This is borne out rather sadly in the history of colonialism, where trade, whether free or not, whether it was of human beings or not, always required force to sustain the transaction. No doubt there are exceptions, and libertarians love to highlight these because they want to argue that government is not really necessary at all. But these exceptions are few and far between. Where the participants in trade are on an equal footing, the libertarian ideal may momentarily apply. Trade can be mutually beneficial and unpoliced. But where there's a power imbalance, all bets are off. The strong take what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This is what the ancient political philosophers called pleonexia, or the desire to take more than one share. It's a species of selfishness or self-interest, and unfortunately it has become the foundation of our economy because of the neoliberal ideological justification I described earlier. But without government to police markets, regulate the exchange, and ensure its fairness, there can be no fair exchange when the power imbalance is too great. This is the dilemma of neoliberalism. It espouses an ideology of free exchange, but it utterly neglects the social and governmental conditions which sustain that exchange and make it possible. Indeed, I'd go so far as to suggest that it actively undermines the conditions of social trust that sustain free exchange and social peace. As the Harvard political philosopher Michael Sandel suggests, the extension of market thinking to every aspect of social life is predatory on the social capital of trust, which is the more possible. Excessive monetization and privatization of every social exchange ultimately corrodes the trust which functions as the bond of our common citizenship and our sociability. And this is only made all the worse when the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small number of oligarchs today makes the Gilded Age of the so-called robber barons of the 1890s look tolerable and quaint by comparison. This is our present dilemma, and we see it at work in our politics. For at least the last 50 years, wealthy libertarians and so-called conservatives like the Koch brothers and others who want to undo regulation have argued that governmental power is a threat to individual freedom. Their willingness to fund such attitudes has led us to a situation where the freely elected government is regarded as the enemy, which must be opposed. Such thinking is proposed in a variety of ways. We hear the IRS is the enemy, that government is ineffective and must be hogtied or limited, for it is threatening to take away your guns. Gun rights advocates weirdly cite King Leonidas of Sparta's response to the Persians when they asked him to surrender his weapons. Molon lave, he said, come and take them away. But it doesn't require a PhD to notice that to cite this precedent cast our own freely elected representative government as the enemy invader. Let me underscore this point. I urge you to take a moment and consider how twisted and confused this rhetoric is. This slogan casts a representative government that protects and guarantees the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment as a foreign invader. And the fact that this government is a sole guarantor of the very right in question is completely ignored. Such univocal insistence on the supremacy of individual rights has led to objections to school vaccinations and vaccine and mask mandates that are essential for preserving public health. Yet this common good is deemed inferior to the individual's right to refuse to comply. Such thinking has inspired Moms for Liberty to censor public and school libraries, and it is the same thinking behind the movement for school choice and charter school vouchers. There's been a host of such efforts, and they've become the central focus of the so-called Liberty Caucus. Such public health restrictions and requirements involve an infringement on liberty, we are told, because such views restrict our individual choice. What is forgotten in this context is the purpose of the state, which is to uphold our common interests in preserving the value of individual choice. The problem with such views is simple. If everyone's rights are absolute, how do we prevent the exercise of those so-called liberties from infringing on the rights of those who want a robust public health system and who want to limit the number of mass shootings? If you want the freedom not to wear a mask or get vaccinated, what is too often ignored and goes unstated is the fact that this liberty infringes on the liberty of those who want to avoid infection and stay healthy in the midst of a pandemic. Just as the unrestricted interpretation of the Second Amendment infringes on the liberty of those who want to reduce the number of mass shootings and end the epidemic of gun violence. The origins of many of these anti-governmental libertarian crusades is beautifully outlined in Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, which quite clearly describes how libertarian ideology adopted by many and economic thinking adopted by many Republicans and Republican legislators in the 80s and 90s made the absolute destruction of governmental effectiveness into its primary goal. Indeed, this goal is implicit in Reagan's quip that the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And in my view, January 6, 2021, in which the American citizens attacked their freely elected government, is a logical flowering and conclusion of such anti-governmental rhetoric. And thus, we reap what we sow. For what has been sown is not democratic pluralism, but a neoliberal libertarian ideology of radical self-interest, which always promotes self-interest above the common good. America has always been composed of diverse interests, but if we are to continue to make many out of one and live together in harmony and face the challenges ahead, we need a better political philosophy to sustain our political discourse, one that emphasizes more than our private interests. That is, a political philosophy which emphasizes a more robust conception of the common good and what our shared interests are. Charles Taylor, another Canadian political philosopher, has criticized the conception I've been describing as negative liberty. This idea of freedom from control of the state is negative in the sense that it lacks any positive concept of the purpose that liberty serves. It's the idea of saying no, not saying what no is for. It is construed negatively as freedom from, without elaborating an answer to the question of what freedom is for. My contention here is that we've become so obsessed with individual rights that we've completely forgotten what freedom is really for. And because of this forgetfulness, we run the risk of dismantling the entire political edifice of representative democracy, which has been created to preserve that freedom. We would be wise to recall the Greek conception of freedom and think more about our obligations to our country's welfare than about our own private interests. If we don't, I fear we may soon enter a time when government is incapable of protecting the very rights and liberties we insist upon and cherish the most. Thank you all.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Erich Freiberger, everybody. Erich Freiberger. Erich, you covered so much territory in that ground. I wondered if this was something you thought that maybe we were part of the dissertation judging panel, and, and that we are going to make comments on your presentation relative to the level of expertise and intelligence that you offered to us. I want to offer up this opportunity to open it up for questions and comments to Erich. And if nobody has a question or a comment, I have at least 4 dozen questions
Okay,
and
good.
comments
Bring it
I
on,
would
Ken.
like to offer. But let's
Bring it on.
start with Wendell Jackson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I loved your presentation. You hit a lot of points. And I apologize to anyone in the crowd who is one of those, if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. But I've been reverse engineering this money thing, and I've gotten all the way back to who owned the first anything in which to utilize to barter with. And do we really have to buy and sell? Are we part of nature, or are we conditioned to believe that we've got to do this monetary thing in order to be alive on the planet? And it is quite confusing, and some of us would like to extricate ourselves from it, so to speak, off the grid, where we have food and shelter, the water thing, it falls from the sky, the necessary stuff, and not utilizing this money system and the taxation and the represent. Anyway, I hope I didn't offend anyone.
No
but
offense. No offense. Go ahead.
but some of us would like to be out of it. No 9 to 5. We just follow nature's lead. We grow, what they call food forests, permaculture, take the good earth and make a little, not a mansion with 92 gold-plated toilets, just a little thing where you could have shelter from the elements and tend to your little crops, the stuff that you need, what's considered weeds in the modern society that says you have to have this lawn and it has to be manicured, that kind of stuff. So I like I said, I listened to you. You presented both 3-4 sides of the debate, and there are some of us who would like to, we don't want to fuss and fight, we don't want to pillage, we don't want to burn anything down, we would just like to get out of the system and live peacefully till we expire and go back.
Wendell, can I say a word about that?
Certainly.
I first of all, if I could live in the beautiful background that you have behind you and escape in that way, I think I would be happy to do so. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Right, that's Palm Coast.
Oh, really? Well, it's quite beautiful. I guess I live closer there than I thought. I'm not sure I've achieved the requisite level of freedom that's displayed in your background. But I did hear an interesting piece on NPR. I don't know if it was yesterday or earlier today, about Puerto Rico, where I taught at the University of Puerto Rico about 25 years ago for a couple of years. It was my first job out of grad school. And Puerto Rico, as you know, has gotten slammed by hurricanes and earthquakes repeatedly, and it's kind of a mess. And the power grid is tenuous at best. And there's talk about people setting up, microgrids and to be precisely self-sufficient in the way that you describe. And I think that's a reasonable solution, certainly for Puerto Rico, if not for many other places on the planet. I mean, I'm not sure that we need a power grid that stretches hundreds of miles. It would make much more sense if we had local solar mini grids. I do know that in Germany they have a lot of that. They have like small scale microgrids all over the country, and they're, for a country that has very little sun, they're incredibly energy efficient. That's just an aside. I mean, it's not a direct response to what you say, but thank you for your comments.
Right. There's somebody. Susan, go ahead.
Wendell, do you have a follow-up, or should we go to Susan?
Well, I will come get back in the queue, but Miss Susan.
Okay, I appreciate that very much, Wendell. Thank you very much. Susan, let's go to you.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself. So if I correctly understood your introduction, you are also on the ethics committee for the city. So I know your talk was on liberty, but it seemed it also was about government. And what I think one of the things that happens with people is we start to distrust the government because there seems to be corruption. Even recently, it seems like some of the city council members are getting special treatment for some of their nonprofits for money. So like Jacoby Pittman and Nick Howland and some of the charter schools are getting money. So what can you do about that in your, is it a volunteer or a paid position with the ethics committee? Do you feel like expanding?
It would be lovely if it were paid, Susan, but it's volunteer. It's kind of a thankless job. We've gotten dumped on of late by some of the people you mentioned, actually. And it's sometimes more work than you'd like it to be. But the problem for me is, I mean, I come as a philosopher with a background in philosophical ethics, and the problem for me is the way the ethics code is written in the city. It's very legalistic. I mean, most of the people on the ethics commission are lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but and you can't. What I understand by ethics and what they're describing as ethics is if it's not in the law, we can't call them on it, basically. If they don't violate the letter of the law, there's not a whole lot we can do. We can't say that we think they violated the spirit. That's just going to get us into all kinds of trouble, or so I'm frequently told. And it's shocking to me, as somebody who's not a lawyer who approaches this from a very different perspective. I think the cases you mentioned where they were discovered to have benefited from their own nonprofits, that happened before I actually came on, and there have not been. I mean, yeah, I was shocked by it as a citizen. I think it's disturbing and troubling. I mean, in my view, ethics means there should be no self-dealing whatsoever by anybody in government. They should not benefit at all. There should be a firewall between them and any benefits, period. The trouble is the way the ethics commission is set up and works. And the ethics commission had to originally be approved by the very city council that it governs, among other offices in the city. So as much as they could get when they set it up was a set of legal restrictions that require every city employee, everyone who works for the city, everyone who works for a commission to comply with certain standards and values. And if they violate those, then we can investigate and call them in and call foul when they fail to live up to it. But we can't really go into the nebulous ground of saying, well, we think that what you did was, engage in an unethical spirit. I mean, I wish we could. I'd be all for that, but I'm usually outvoted on such matters. So thank you for the question.
Okay, Fred, you're up.
Hello. I enjoyed your presentation, Eric, and I was thinking of that it seems like too often under the ultra-libertarian, ultra-conservative stances, we might get laws passed, but then they are regulations, and then they understaff and underfund the enforcement of those regulations, or they write laws that's so weaselly that that can be interpreted in any number of ways. And a lot of times it seems like if our guy does it, fine. If your guy does it, we're going to lambast him and tar and feather him.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, for example, under Trump, there's when you cut, or even more recently, when you remember the way people howled when the discussion was we're going to add all these extra IRS agents. There was a strong objection to that, and that just what that expresses about government is very strange. I mean, it's a weird attitude. I mean, shouldn't we all be willing to pay our fair share? But the idea is the IRS is the enemy, and that's a little bit crazy, and I think a little bit dangerous. More than a little bit, I think it's very dangerous. I think everybody ought to be willing to pay their fair share. Of course, no one wants to pay more tax than they have to. I get that. but we should. It's when we perceive people at the top, Warren Buffett telling us that he pays less tax than his secretary who makes $100,000 a year. That's a problem. That's a really disturbing problem that delegitimates the entire system. So when the system is delegitimated in that way, then yes, people feel like, well, why the hell should I have to pay? No one wants to pay. I mean, this is exactly what happened actually historically in Greece. I mean, Greece, as you know, had a terrible financial crisis. And it used to be that when you were constructing a building, if the building wasn't completed, you didn't have to pay taxes. So 20 or 30 years ago, all of these, every building had an imaginary third floor with rebar sticking out that would never get completed, so they wouldn't have to pay taxes. Well, the European Union definitely whipped Greece into line, and I was really surprised when I was over there this spring that the economy is actually pretty good. I mean, there are a lot of many things are inexpensive. I mean, many people are struggling, but businesses are thriving. Some of the problems that they were experiencing 4 or 5 years ago are no longer there. They seem to have bounced back from COVID.
Yeah,
but anyway.
I was going to say, I lived in Hanya for a couple of years in the 90s, and I saw some of the buildings that were like that, and also damaged from World War II that they had not repaired in 50 years.
Erich, are you there? Erich Freiberger?
Uh-oh.
I think Erich is, to use a technical term, frozen. I think Erich is frozen. Oh, Erich, you're back.
Am I back?
Yeah, you were frozen for 30 seconds. It was fascinating to watch too. But now you're gone. Gone again. Well, this is good. We can do this this happens every 10 seconds.
Is there a Kentucky moment?
Yeah, like
Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I'm on my my hotspot, so
Oh,
hopefully
okay.
it'll work.
That might be better because you froze
Okay.
up twice there. So
Okay.
I don't know, Fred, you'd finish your comment, or Erich, you were in the process of making.
I was kind of free associating based on what Fred was saying. So I don't know if Fred do you have an additional question, Fred?
Well, just on the also comment on the common goods are where the environment. We look upon that we can take as much as we want and poison as much as we want from the ultra conservative stance or insane conservative stance, I think, where it doesn't matter how much poison we put in the streams. Well, it'll be fixed, or God will fix it. If we poison all our fresh water, we kill all the animals. Like, okay, why should we have any hunting limits at all? Just destroy everything. And of course, in the pasture pigeons, went from 1 billion birds, go to the 1800s, to none by 2020.
Well,
they're like,
look, I don't want to sound like I don't want to sound like a total radical, but that's simply capitalism at work. Shunt off the cost on, economics doesn't take account of what's external to the market. What's external to the market is cleanliness of streams, pollution in the air. And so if somebody can make money by exploiting those things that the market doesn't take care of and maybe degrading them as they exploit them, they will do so if they are rewarded by the market, which they are. And that's our problem. And so when we look at something as complex as climate change, to get this aggressive late capitalist system in which we all live, and we're all part of it, to change, it's not going to change of its own volition. That's what people need to understand. It will only change when there's enough political pressure to make it change. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school in Massachusetts, MassPIRG, the public interest research group, tried to pass packaging law. Because if you look at the amount of plastic that we use, it's obscene. When I just recently flew back from London, I mean, on the airplane, every single item on the tray for the meal they served me was wrapped in plastic. We went through a couple of plastic cups. I mean, it kind of turns my stomach every time I see this. When I teach, I see 4 or 5 students having plastic disposable containers, and it's there are almost 8 billion of us on the planet. We can't continue to do this without limiting it in some way. And until we make a concerted effort, not an individual effort. You can ride your bike to work all you want. You can avoid using plastic all you want. It won't make the slightest dent. We have to all do it together. We need to get large businesses on board. We need to get, everybody's got to do it. And until we have the political will to do that, I don't think you should feel guilty at all about, I don't think an individual should feel guilty at all. A corporation, sure, if they're dumping poison into a stream, yes, absolutely. But I teach environmental ethics at the university, and I often refer to it as hitchhiking the highway of despair. It's such a depressing course because things that were predicted would happen, 10 years ago, things that they predicted 10 years ago would take 30 years to happen are already happening now. And the only solace I've been able to take is that, and it's a community problem. Until we approach it as a community problem, as a political problem, it will not be addressed. And so the idea that, we're somehow going to magically get corporations to be sustainable, or go green, what do they do instead? They greenwash. They pretend like they're green, but they continue to pollute, and so on. And so people aren't going to do this willingly until we, as the citizens of this country, the citizens of the world, say, nope, we're not going to take it anymore. You need to change. And that's, there's so many disincentives to doing that for most people, because the whole system is set up to be extraordinarily wasteful, because people are profiting from it.
Okay.
So I'm glad I cheered you up. I'm glad I was able to cheer you all up.
Yeah. Well, you talk about political will, and then I'm going to go to Mary Wall, but you talk about political will and how difficult that is, and we can point to examples of political will that have been very successful, but not overnight, and not over a year, not over even somebody's lifetime necessarily. So at this moment in time, Erich Freiberger, how hopeful are you with the political will that you seek?
Thank you, Ken, for that very easy question, and I'm being facetious. I'm not very hopeful right now. I'm deeply worried, as I think I suggested at the end of my talk. I don't think that, I think we've gotten to a point where this insistence on individual rights has sort of corrupted our sense of common decency, our sense of common purpose as a nation. I mean, just think back to, Colin Kaepernick kneeling and the firestorm that raised. There's a sense of we're all at each other's throats and we can't agree about anything, and there's nothing, it's disturbing. We still have 40% of voters think that, Trump would make a great president. I mean, these are all very disturbing signs to me.
It's even more. But go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt you. That's
you're trying to depress me more, Ken, and I find that troubling.
Yeah, right. I know.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a crisis. We're in the middle of a crisis of identity and belief, and I don't think that I think that crisis has been caused by steady erosion of neoliberal self-interested thinking in both economics and politics. I don't have to look out for anybody else. I mean, people often used to say to me, don't you want to vote for this guy because you'll get a tax cut? Wouldn't that be in your interest? And I don't know if in my entire life I've ever voted my immediate economic interest. I know many people do, and they think that's what they're supposed to do, but I think that's part of the problem. I don't think you should vote your economic interest. I think you should vote your sense of what's appropriate. I mean, and look, I grew up, my father was an entrepreneur, and I remember he taught me the law of supply and demand when I was 4 years old. I'm not kidding. I'm not joking. And used to say, you vote with your dollar. Well, you don't vote with your dollar. I mean, as a citizen, I might pull into Buc-ee's for cheap gas. I mean, excuse me, as a consumer, I might pull into Buc-ee's for cheap gas. But as a citizen, I might be the first person out on the picket line saying, no Buc-ee's here on this wetland. My interest as a citizen and my interest as a consumer are not the same. And the presupposition that they are is a presupposition that's born out of the idea that economic self-interest is the only metric that we can use to judge success in our country. We have no vision of success beyond wealth. And by that standard, you know, the Bill Gates and the Elon Musks and the Warren Buffetts of the world are the most quote unquote successful. But you know, by the same time, at the same token, you know, economic theory also recognizes that, you know, Friedrich Hayek, one of the most conservative libertarian thinkers, recognizes that people who are successful don't have any special merit. They just happen to get lucky and be successful. There's no merit involved. They're not better than you or me, but we're constantly making that association. Success in a capitalist economy has nothing to do with merit, because the economy is like this, you know, conventional hothouse where people, you know, figure out a way to, you know, they figure out what they have to do. And my argument is essentially that the kind of thinking that occurs in this hothouse, the kind of systematically self-interested thinking that takes no regard for the common good, corrodes the very basis of the market exchange, which generates that wealth and generates benefits. And so we need to somehow or another limit it.
Okay, but Bud, did you have your hand up, Bud?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Bud.
To what we're talking about, I wrote a blog a long time ago. Some of you may have already read it. It's entitled budsteak.blogspot.com. It speaks to much of what we're talking about. If you can understand and put together the logic, it consists of 25 postulates. If you can understand those postulates and put them all together, it answers an awful lot of the questions that we're raising here. budsteak.blogspot.com. It'll be worth your reading.
Bud. Good to see you.
All right. Other comments or questions? I see Wendell's got his hand up. Wendell, go ahead.
Thank you again, nice folks. And like I said, once I started reverse engineering it, you know, you come to the, you know, the thing, who says we've got to buy and sell? Who says we've got to get that, you know, work on our credit score so we could get a better rate for a loan? We are part of nature. Animals do not partake of like a money system. They're like, it's resources. I could either eat this, mate with it, you know, continue the gene pool, whatever it is. Now we're supposed to have the most advanced brain. Yeah, we've been lied to in a lot of ways. We're wonderful human beings, but we have so many false concepts that we are bumping into each other. And we, with our money system, we're like the cancer on the planet. We are killing it, but we can't see that because we've been conditioned to believe I can't be lazy. But our Buckminster Fuller says, if you want to dismantle a system, you build something better next to it, and people will gravitate towards that, which is we go back to growing our food, doing the microgrid type thing, so you won't have water, you know, city water supplies that are contaminated and thousands of people are being affected. You won't have your grid going down. We can do it. It's just there are people, politicians, because they've got to get their portfolios in order. So they're like, hey, we can't, you know, pass laws that say, because I remember some time ago, a lady in Florida, she had her wells dug and her power bank, and they refused to issue her a certificate of occupancy until she got connected to the grid. And of course, you know, she didn't have money to fight them and say, hey, I am independent. I am of the planet. Why do I need your system? So she, you know, agreed, you know, to being hooked up to the system. But why is it that she had her engineering where she built her home and it was sturdy enough that it wouldn't collapse on her, but the pressures from the powers that be that don't want people to see that we can be independent of government. We can say, I will not harm another human being. And everybody, if everybody were to say that, it's the colonialism thing about the doctrine of discovery. We've been conditioned, hey, I own you because I sailed, and my God says, I have the right to be owning you, everything that I land on, including the people. But we can reverse engineer it and go back and say, no, we have to stop the insanity. I see other people here. Thank you. Other people in the queue. Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
I just answer that I don't think it's possible for us to go back to some kind of like state of nature. I think we've already so corrupted the planet, and there's so many of us on the planet, and there's so many different competing needs that we can't. Yes, we're part of nature, but our nature as human beings is to create law and to have values that we create through speech, and have laws and ideals that we live by. And I don't think those laws are random. I think that too is part of our nature. Our convention is part of our nature. My argument is not that trade is bad or markets are bad because they're conventional. My argument is that markets are not natural. There's nothing natural about markets. They are conventional, but we need to understand that convention is sustained by is only sustained by government, and by it's not, I'm not saying this very well. It's not something that markets are only sustained by government. That was the point I was trying to make.
All right. Patrick, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, very, very fascinating talk. I very much appreciate you giving this. My question is more so related to, what do you think that needs to be done to help educate people about, what liberty really is and why people are pitching them what they're pitching them, and to also effectuate change? I think the simple answer there is vote, but I don't think that's effective enough and quick enough to really get us to the places that perhaps we where we want to be. So I'd like to just get your thoughts on, what do you think would be the
I mean,
quickest and most
that's a
helpful?
really good question. Because I teach and I'm an educator, I always take refuge in that. I mean, I try to educate people. That's what I try to do. I always try to bring to my students the idea that the simple answers are usually way more complex than they appear. Simple answers sound good at first, but upon analysis, they tend not to hold up so well. And that it's important to understand the complexity of the world, and realize that things aren't often as simple as they seem. I mean, look, it's clear we are, in the next 50 years, we are going to undergo a number of very important transitions. And one of them is going to involve the transition away from fossil fuels to some extent. I don't know to what degree we're going to succeed in doing that. But how quickly we do that, whether or not we do it quickly enough to slow down, or at least slow down the progression of climate change, is going to be really important. And I think we've had good evidence of that this year with the fire, from the fires in Canada to the fires and the hurricane in California to the incredibly hot temperatures here. I mean, I was just in London. It was 95 degrees every day the week I was there. I was like ready for London weather, and it was boiling hot the entire time I was there. So, it's really happening. This is real. And I think even a lot of conservatives are starting to acknowledge that. Now, will big business be a driver to make the kinds of requisite changes that we need to make to alleviate this? Possibly to some degree. Do I think they'll do it all the way? Do I think they'll do it willingly? No. I mean, I heard today on the news that California is suing all the big oil companies for denying climate change. I mean, that's a good start. Hold people responsible. hold people responsible for what they do and say. I'm all for that. And I think that's, there was an interesting case, I believe it was in Montana, where 16 kids sued the state based on their claim that the state violated the state constitution when they didn't, because they weren't doing anything about climate change. And that is going to be overturned, I'm sure. But the mere fact that a lawsuit like that got as far as it did, and it got some traction, and they were given legal standing, is really significant. So, I mean, I think educate, militate, talk to people, communicate, and spread the word to the degree you can. But I often talk to my students about this. If you go into Home Depot and you go into the electrical section, what do you see? Or any construction part of the store, you see all this stuff that's approved by the city and city building code and the National Underwriters Limited, for electrical. Everything's stamped with that UL mark. Well, there's a whole process, there's a whole system of production and consumption and delivery to stores that's built around that. And until that whole system changes, nothing's going to change. But to change every part of that system, it's not like just turning a battleship, which takes a long time. It's turning a whole fleet of battleships. And so where do you start? Well, you just start. I mean, it doesn't matter how you do it. I think you just start doing it. You start talking about it. You start trying to raise awareness. You start trying to educate, and you vote. No question, you vote. But there's a kind of know-nothing backlash that we're experiencing right now. I mean, there's an insistence that 40, 45, 47, whatever it is, percent of the people that support Trump think that, oh, well, he couldn't possibly be guilty of the things he's been charged with. Those are just lies, or Democratic lies. And there's an attitude about climate change, unfortunately. And it's, I think, been very well documented, and I think many more conservatives are starting to acknowledge the reality of it. We are going to have to do something about it. And I think as it forces difficult, expensive choices on low-lying cities like St. Augustine and Miami and Tampa, and to some degree, perhaps even Jacksonville, it's going to become more real. And voters are going to see, people are going to see that I think it's going to take big crisis. I think it's going to take something like a hurricane swamping Tampa, like Katrina swamped New Orleans, for people to really wake up and pay attention, unfortunately. Because we're seeing lots of smaller examples of that. There's Hurricane Sandy. There was all the flooding that happened here 4 or 5 years ago. Lots of small and very expensive examples. That's one of the reasons why our insurance rates are through the roof right now. I mean, they're through the roof. I mean, my condo association is anticipating an increase of something like 200% in their insurance rates. I personally was served with a couple months ago with an increase of 113%, double what I already paid. I mean, that means my cost of living is going up by hundreds of dollars per month, hundreds. And, I can handle it, but it's a mess, and it's a mess caused to some degree by our failure to, there are lots of causes, but one of the causes is our failure to address in a kind of significant way the problem of these storms and climate change. And, but for us to address it in a realistic way, many, many things have to change. And I'm not sure that they're all going to change at once, but I think we're definitely going the wrong direction now.
Stephen Stoll, all the way from Thailand, by the way. This man is sitting in Thailand, somewhere, I don't know, in the jungle.
What time is it, Stephen? It must be 3 a.m. there. What time is it there?
It's coffee time. Outside the window that you see in Wendell's picture, that's how it is all the time here. So if you want to come to a place where it's like that all the time, come to Thailand. So
sounds lovely.
I just want to, one of the political issues that irritates me the most is this notion of libertarianism, or that we can go and live in our own little groups. And this is a notion, I think, that's way outlived its usefulness. We live in a society, and we have 8 billion people on this planet. And as you've pointed out, it has very limited resources, and it's been polluted and poisoned all over the place. This notion that we can separate and live in these little groups and take care of ourselves, I think, is really the most ridiculous of all of these notions. But I didn't get the beginning of your talk. I'm not sure that you talked about Adam Smith and at the beginning of capitalism, but even Adam Smith, who invented capitalism, did not believe in unregulated capitalism.
I pointed that out. I
Okay.
did cover that.
Good, because
briefly, but I did mention that. Yeah.
Here's a guy that came up with the whole idea, and he realized that you needed regulation, that you can't just let free markets rape the planet. And that's what we've done, is we've allowed this this idea to just go absolutely crazy. A lot of my friends on the left, I listen to them rant against capitalism, and I always think capitalism is a problem, but it's not the problem. It's unregulated capitalism. Is this notion that you can just take what you want.
The flavor of capitalism we've been served up in this country for the last 50 years has been neoliberalism, which is in effect it's Milton Friedmanism, unregulated capitalism.
Absolutely.
I think I mentioned the 4 horsemen of the neoliberal apocalypse: low taxes, austere government, privatization, and deregulation. And that's all we've been served, and that was the Trump presidency to a large degree. If there's a regulation, get rid of it. You heard Ramaswamy say in the first Republican debate, we got to get rid of the administrative state. What would that do? It would just completely get rid of any regulation whatsoever. And the danger is that kind of unleashed individual property right of a corporation to go in and do whatever they want, whether it's poison in the water or poison in the air or what have you, that's the kind of thing that already is threatening to destroy the complex structure of our modern civilization, our modern society. I mean, we see all these apocalyptic TV shows and science fiction shows about what would happen if the system were to somehow fail, if there were a horrible pandemic and so forth. But the system is so complicated. I think it's a little scary to imagine what would happen if it would fail, because it could fail under certain circumstances, and that's
Sure.
I mean, I wouldn't say it keeps me up at night, but it's not something that is impossible to conceive. And if it failed, it would be catastrophic, because the complexity of you live in Thailand. I'm sure you've flown there. The complexity of flying back and forth between airports. Look at an airport. Look at a subway system. Look at the highway system in this country. I mean, look at the water system. Look at all the things that we depend on that are provided by what? Government, right?
Yes.
And if those things don't exist and they're already falling apart here. I mean, I live right near the Matthews Bridge, and I think, okay, it's going on 70 years old. And then you read about bridges elsewhere around the country falling apart. If there aren't engineers checking that on a regular basis and ensuring me that I'm not going to fall on, 100 feet into the water when I drive over it, that's a real problem for everybody that lives in the city and all of us. And that, if you multiply that by tens of thousands of times, I think you get a sense of just how complex the world is that we live in. You can't go back. We can't go back to some kind of state of nature. It doesn't exist. I mean, you can.
Nor should we want to. Yes.
No,
I
we have to.
One of the problems here is the failure in academia, in that economics has been the discipline that has won the war, and sociology and philosophy have been treated as an old-fashioned, silly science. And the reality is, we live in a society. Sociologists and philosophers have understood these issues for a long time, have been talking about these issues, but economics has won the argument.
Well,
and
you're absolutely
everything
right.
is economics today.
I mean, the trouble is when you have something measurable, something qualitative and something quantitative, the default is to go with a quantitative, statistical, numerical assessment because it appears to be clearer. This is a battle
Even
I fight
when
on a
it's
regular
not
basis at the
actually
university.
true. You mentioned trickle down economics. It's not true, but they argue that so that most people think,
Well,
yeah, give money to rich.
I don't think I mentioned trickle down economics. What I mentioned was that
You mentioned the
we've
guy.
gone from a vision of the good life, a vision of saying, what do we think what's our vision of human flourishing? What is freedom for? We literally don't answer that. We say, oh, freedom is only for liberty, is really only for people to do whatever the hell they want. You can have as much liberty as you want, provided you don't interfere with mine. The John Stuart Mill principle. Fine, but when no one says what liberty is for, the only way we have to assess success, the only metric that we have is literally GDP. Yes. It's GDP. And GDP doesn't even take account, notoriously doesn't take account of distribution of gross domestic product. I mean, it just, four of the richest guys in the country make up a third or a half of that, and the rest of us make up the rest of it. It doesn't really, I'm not sure it's a very helpful metric. It just says we have produced a bunch of stuff. It doesn't tell us whether that stuff has made our lives better or not. It just says we produced it, we bought it, we've consumed it. And in the case of many of the things we consume, I think they're absolutely, not only are they potentially inimical to health, I'm thinking, cow milk with hormones in it, beef with hormones, et cetera, but we no longer have any metric or political will to devolve to create a metric of what is really valuable. And so in a sense, what I was trying to argue is that we're living on borrowed time, and that borrowed time is our historical, traditional sense of trust and decency that comes from the societal end. And the more we monetize things, the more we engage in market thinking, the more that corrodes the social foundation that sustains markets and sustains our, common living together. And that's what I see as a real danger, is that, I can give you a couple of examples. I mean, when I first moved to Jacksonville, this is, 25 years ago, I bought a little house in San Marco, and I was seeking to add on to it. And this contractor came over to talk to me about that. We had a conversation about it. And afterwards, he tried to engage in network marketing with me. And he wanted me to, he said, hey, I've got this thing where if you persuade all your friends to join up, you're going to get a deeper discount in this purchasing club. And I was so offended, I threw the guy out of my house, because I'm not going to sell my friends. I mean, some people might think that's fine. Great, sell your friends. Sell things to your friends and you get a deeper discount. I found that to be one of the most deeply offensive things that anybody could possibly say to me. My friends are my friends. Don't ask me to make money off them.
That's what
although Dave, I would be willing to make money off David Schwamberg in a heartbeat. I see him up there. And I would happily do that.
Well, speaking of David Schwamberg, let's go right now to Dr. What's that word that for the throat issue you have?
Laryngitis.
Dr. Laryngitis.
Dr. Laryngitis. Dr. Laryngitis. Yeah. So anyway, well, first of all, I apologize for sounding like a frog. And secondly, I apologize for agreeing with most of what Erich said. So that means I can't be there with all of my claws out. One of the things I'm thinking of right now is a good friend of mine in France, who politically is like as close to the center as a human being could possibly be in the political process. Sometimes he votes for the center-right parties in France, sometimes for the center-left parties in France. Very non-ideological guy. And he was asking me once, this was when Obama was president, about Obama's healthcare program, and I had to explain more about the system in the United States, et cetera. And my friend Michel, his face just kept getting more and more like, showing bewilderment because and he finally said, yeah, but what happened to solidarity? Meaning, even for somebody who's non-ideological, who's not of the left, who's not of the right, the idea of solidarity with your fellow citizens was a value, was an assumption, wasn't just a value. And the reason I was thinking of that is because a lot of what we were talking about are arguments. They have to do with propaganda. They have to do with going back to chapter and verse in Adam Smith and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and everybody else. But a lot of this has to do with political culture. And I don't want to present the Europeans as any sort of saints, because, of course, they had the huge colonial empires and they exploited people right and left. But in the current political culture, even on the right in Europe, you still have this sense of solidarity. They want to exclude certain people, but they want to include. It's not deciding it's only the individual against everybody else. It's our group against other groups, but we want to take care of our own group. And to me, what I'm trying to get at is so much of what we're talking about now has to do with American culture. One of the reasons that a reactionary group for Moms with Liberty that desperately want us to catch up with Cuba and China in terms of censorship and restricting liberty, they're still in their arguments appealing to that mythology of the individual, the Daniel Boone, the Davy Crockett, the lone entrepreneur who fights his way from the bottom up to the top. And so the political culture itself sort of presents itself as
I think you're absolutely right.
an obstacle.
I think that that's more pronounced in America and England and Britain than it is in
England too, yes.
And there's the version of capitalism that you see in in France and Germany and Italy and maybe to a lesser extent Spain is one there's much more cooperation between unions, the government, and firms. Same is true in Japan. It's a kind of like a more cooperative form of capitalism, whereas in England and America we're much more market oriented. You don't buy from somebody just because you've had a long-term relationship with them. You buy from the cheapest supplier, and so there you kind of like, because it's a world where you can do that, you can get away with that because everybody kind of expects that, and as a result there's very little solidarity, whether it be in the market or in society itself, and that's troubling. I agree that's part of the problem. There's who seems to care in this country about the homeless people all over this city or all over democratic cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles. I mean, we let this happen, and we let it happen because we don't have any kind of meaningful response to it, because any meaningful response to it doesn't fit with our dominant ideology. I mean, I don't mean to let Democrats off the hook for neoliberalism. I mean, Clinton and Obama were both neoliberals. They just weren't as evil about it as Republicans tend to be. They were a softer, gentler version, but it was still neoliberalism. I mentioned Michael Sandel, and he's got a really interesting book called The Tyranny of Merit, which came out, I think it was in 2020, about how he goes through speech after speech by Obama and Clinton talking about equality of opportunity as we're going through a time when there's the greatest growth in inequality in American history, and that's just simply not enough to say yes, you too can can come to America and strike it rich and be wealthy. You too could be Elon Musk. I mean, this kind of dream fantasy story. Yeah, sure, it comes true for some people, no question, but that's not enough to provide to people that are really hurting. There's no sense of solidarity here in our culture. Absolutely none. I mean, we don't have any way of expressing it, even though you find that there's a church or synagogue every corner, but it doesn't do a damn bit of good. There's not that some of those organizations don't do some good here and there, but it's not pervading the political culture at large. And so I fear that I've just depressed everyone now. Now I feel bad.
No. We're on a roll right now. And David, Larry, Jai,
Okay.
do you?
I'm depressed. Say something cheerful.
Okay, let me ask you this question. All right, on a more cheerful note.
All right.
Is it true, Erich Freiberger, Dr. Erich Freiberger, that we
Herr Dr. Professor Freiberger.
Professor, is it true that we are all temporary?
Well, yeah, of course it is.
So when you talk,
I don't think any of us is here forever.
So when you talk about borrowed time, whose time are we borrowing if we are all temporary?
That is an unexamined metaphor, isn't it? We're borrowing our own. I mean, we just don't have much time left to deal with, whether it's to deal with the climate crisis or to live. Again, you wanted me to cheer you up. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that.
I was waiting.
I mean, we're all finite. I mean, I'm constantly reminding my students that everything human is tentative and not just temporary. It's tentative and mortal and finite, and we don't know all the answers, and we're always the best we can do is search for them. That's the best we can do.
Right. Okay. So more specifically, in terms of trying to get rid of the unregulated state, as a lot of the GOP has been talking about, and we go back to Ronald Reagan talking about that, and in the debates we saw, if we watched the debates with the GOP this year, maybe a month or so ago, or less than a month or so ago, we're talking about the state is too regulated, we have to get rid of it. So why, from your perspective, is that such a popular idea when it seems to work against the very interests of the individuals who proffer it, except for those in power? Why is it a political advantageous thing that gives Trump about 50% of the polling numbers compared to Biden at this point in time?
Well, I mean, look, there's an easy answer to that. I'm not sure it's the answer, but it is, to some extent, this is the answer that I alluded to earlier when I mentioned Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit. When the political class, and I'm thinking of the way the Democratic Party froze out Bernie in 2016 to a certain degree, sorry, I'm getting a call, excuse me. When the political class was talking only about equality of opportunity and not doing a whole lot about it, and basically proposing neoliberal policies, and there were a lot of people in states that had suffered severely from NAFTA that had lost their jobs, and it sounded, this is just a big, electing Trump was basically a big fuck you to the establishment, because they felt like they'd been ignored, and people are just angry and they're frustrated. And look,
okay, all right.
If I were 20 years old right now,
Eric,
hold on a second. Hold on a second. If I were 25 years old right now, living in Jacksonville, and I made $30,000 a year, I would not be able to buy a house.
Right. But
I'd be mad. I mean, I'm mad about other things, but I'd be madder. I'd be really upset. So I think that the people are just finding that things aren't working for them, and they're looking around for somebody to blame. I mean,
They're
that's the
mad at
best.
the wrong people.
Beg your pardon?
They're mad at the wrong people.
Yeah, well, that may be,
Why
but
are
those
they
people are
mad at
very good. They're very good at the sophistry of misdirecting blame. They're
Yeah.
very good at making the argument, and they have a lot of money at their disposal, as you mentioned, because of
Money. Yeah.
Citizens United, and they're doing their best to exploit that advantage, and they continue to do that, and it's a big problem. I mean, I agree with you that until we do something about Citizens United, it's not going to make a damn bit of difference. That's the first thing we need to do. The first thing we need to do is take care of Citizens United. The second thing we need to do is restore some kind of pass some kind of national voting law. But that's not going to happen until Democrats are back in power.
And a
Even then, I don't know if
separation
they've got
of
the will to
church
do
and
it.
a separation of church and state amendment.
We have one, don't we? I mean, don't we have? Isn't that written into our Constitution? How about we just live up to it?
Well, but I think there needs to be a separate amendment, so we've reinforced that idea.
I mean, I'm not as troubled by that as many in this group might be. I don't think that's where we need to be spending our political capital. Let me put it that way. I think that would be a mistake that would unnecessarily alienate people and pit them against our goals. And I think we need to be cognizant of that politically. The people that are advocating for the kind of change that we're discussing, whoever they might be, need to be cognizant of that politically. If you go around offending people who might be your allies, you're not going to win.
Who are those 70 million people who vote for Orange Hitler? Who are they?
They're your neighbors.
They're all white Christians, or vast majority are white Christians who have already bought the biggest lie. So it's easy to lay other lies in there. And they pander, the rich pander.
Yeah, but if you force them, you need to be gentle with them. If you come out gangbusters against them, they're just going to dig in their heels all the more, and you'll never persuade them otherwise. That's my concern. I mean, I don't think you need to go out and try to immediately stick it in their eye. I think you need to try to persuade them that they're backing the wrong guy.
How do you do that when that guy is telling them all the hate that they have 2,000 years building in them?
Well, you do what we're doing. You prosecute that guy. You indict that guy. You hopefully convict that guy, and then you persuade them that he's about the most hypocritical person that a supposedly moral believing Christian could possibly elect.
All right.
And I think that message might get through with time.
There's a test case right now with Lauren Boebert. Let's see if the Christians will turn against Laura Boebert, who played in a theater.
There's videos of Lauren Boebert online right now. We can all go back. So let's go to Wendell, then David, then Susan, and I've got still another dozen questions. Wendell.
All righty. So the eugenics thing of the black and the white people and stuff like that, some race being superior, that has been debunked by science. And unfortunately, in the religion, they don't get exposed to that. And then there's also combined with the great replacement theory. And it's not just America, but Europe, that there are going to be these brown people taking over and replace the white race, when we were all one race, the human race. But any cosmetic difference is due to environmental adaptation and gene pool isolation. So basically, it's just a matter of re-educating people, because the science is there that we are one race living on one planet, even though we may have the grays and the reptilians. I've never seen grays and reptilians myself. But the thing is, we all have, different theories. But
you haven't seen the Republican Congress?
No, this is what I'm saying.
I'm sorry.
Wonderful. No, it's okay. We are all wonderful human beings, and we are harming each other based off of information that that wasn't scientific and still isn't. And this is 2023/4721. according to
I
the
mean, Wendell,
Chinese
I guess I'd say the racism is often it's coded. It's not necessarily
right, the
directed overt,
Muslim type thing.
and as a result, they're long-term associations that are created to permit these people to kind of a certain degree of disavowal. They can both say, well, I'm not a racist, while actually at the same time supporting policies that are essentially racist. And I think that rhetoric is often structured that way, so people can say, well, I'm only voting this way because, and then they give them some other plausible reason. The effect of the vote is the same as the effect of a purely racist attitude.
Right. When I encounter people and they say it's like I said, it's a whole society, because they say like, where are you from? What's your ethnicity? And I said, okay, granted, we were taught all this incorrect stuff, but until we could get to you seeing me as a human being, a valid, viable human being, the same way I view you, you could just violate my human rights or any other right because you don't see me as human.
I'm cheered by the perspective of most younger people. I mean, I deal with a lot of young people most of the time, and I find that they're not, and I don't think it's just the class of people that I deal with at the university, because we have a remarkably diverse group of students at JU. I don't see young folks kind of harboring the same kind of resentful hatred or racism that you might see among 70 or 80-year-olds. And I wonder, you mentioned, Ken mentioned the 70 million people that voted for the Orange Monster. I think, or maybe it was Stephen, I can't remember. I think a lot of those people were older folks. I mean, not exclusively, to be sure, but I mean, somebody asked me earlier, I think it was somebody asked me, am I hopeful about anything? Yeah, I'm hopeful about young people. I'm hopeful that younger people have slightly better attitudes. I'm a little disturbed at the quality of the education they're getting in this state, but because it's been so politicians have tried to control it in such a ham-fisted way. But no, I mean, I'm moderately hopeful that the attitudes are changing certainly about race, slowly. I mean, it's not.
Yes,
it
I
takes
must
time.
agree with you. It's slow, but it's definitely sure, because I've had people and I've associated with them for a little bit, and they see that I'm not doing the rumor mongering, the backstabbing. I'm just treating them like the wonderful human being that the current society doesn't teach them that we are. Granted, I might be one of the very few who's actually doing that. It is confusing because majority sets the status quo, and we're like, man, look at you, I'm like, hey, the melanin production is because some of my ancestors lived on a part of the planet where they needed protection from the ultraviolet rays, and their melanocytes produced melanin. That's what you're seeing now. And I have to let people know I'm not being condescending, because people are like, you're using big. I mean, no, I've got a wide variety of people, and I'm like, no,
Don't use big words. People will resent you for it.
I'm like, no. And Stephen, I must say this. I remember some guests when I was working, and they were like, yeah, thank you, Mr. Jackson, because as a team, we excelled. And they're like, thank you, Mr. Jackson. You guys are, doing well. And I said, yeah. Tell management I need a raise, and not no nickel raise. But she thought I said another word other than 5 cents, and her whole body language. But the person that she was with told her that he meant 5 cents, nickel. And I mean, I didn't, if she had complained with the the zero tolerance policy, I could have been fired. But the thing is, we are all wonderful human beings. And yeah, so I comprehend we are still fussing and fighting with each other. We need to stop it. I am doing my part. I can't force anybody. I can just say, hey, follow the science. You may or may not. I mean, that's your decision. I invite, I encourage, and that's all I can do. And I want to say thank you, you guys.
All right. Very good, Wendell. Let's go to David. I appreciate that. Wendell, excellent. Thank you. David, Larry, Schwamberg, go ahead.
Yes, yes. I sound even more like a frog now, but at any rate, you know, we have to be worried about Trump, and we have to be worried about the demagogues like the Moms for North Korean Liberty and things like that. But we can't let the Democrats off the hook. In 2016, when Trump voters were essentially voting for Trump, saying to the establishment of the Republican Party, "You have let us down," Bernie Sanders was doing the same thing with the Democratic Party, and he came very close to doing the same thing. So Democratic voters and Republican voters were saying to the establishment of both parties, "You have let us down."
But that
The
was in the
only difference-
primaries. But that was in the primaries. So in the general election, they're all just voters. And so the same voters were saying both to the Democratic and the Republican establishment, no, even though Hillary got, 3 million more
Yeah,
votes,
but you were
Trump, he
still
won.
Yeah, but how many people? First of all, there was not an insignificant number of Bernie voters. I don't understand it, but it happened, that went over to Trump. Secondly, a lot of people were just alienated by the whole system, especially when it was shown that the establishment of the Democratic Party was systematically trying to undermine Bernie Sanders.
I
The
agree.
point is, the populace as a whole was frustrated with the establishment of both parties. It turns out to be the case that the Republicans were much better at rounding that up, at exploiting that, even though it's to the detriment of the very people that, whose votes they're trying to get. But we can't take that away. So if you want to get people to move away from the demagoguery of the Moms for Liberty and of the Trumpistas and whatever, the Democrats can't keep doing the same horse manure. They have to show that they're actually offering something different. So you can't just keep screaming and yelling at the Republicans and not demanding fundamental change in the Democratic Party and the Democratic
I agree,
message.
but as you well know, there's no way right now the Democrats are going to be able to get a whole lot done with their tenuous grip on the Senate and their lack of control in the House. This is the dilemma. I remember, this reminds me when
Right.
Obama was in power. I talked to people. I remember my son's guitar teacher said, "Oh, I voted for Obama. I liked him, but he's just not really doing anything anymore." And the problem was he couldn't do anything because he had a divided Congress. And this is the
Right.
dilemma. We want them to do something, and they're not going to get elected unless they do, but they can't get elected because they don't have a venue to do anything. So it's kind of a double bind.
That's definitely the case. But the point is, if the Democrats don't fundamentally change, the best they could possibly do is gain some control in the next 2 years after the next election, and then lose it again, because demagoguery can easily take control of the garbage that the establishment of both parties dish out.
No,
And
I mean,
if
I
it
agree.
doesn't change,
I don't disagree.
then it's
with
2
you
years
at all.
maximum. 2 years maximum.
David,
So you
this
can't-
disturbs me because not only do you agree with me, but I'm agreeing with you now. There's
I
something
know.
wrong. It
This
must
is
be a full
dangerous.
moon.
This is dangerous. Yeah, I'm backing off.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you two kids. All right. Let's go to Susan. Susan, you there?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to talking, Dr. Freiberger. I think you said that you think people
Susan, you can call me Eric.
Okay, great. That's easier to say. Thanks. So the whole church-state separation. So we have the religious liberty, and you talked about liberty in your talk, and then we have the establishment clause, and you said to Lance or Stephen or whatever he's going by these days. So that you think we're too rough on the religious people? Did I misunderstand you? So I would,
Look,
let me
no,
just
I
give
think
you
that we need to be
examples of-
cognizant. I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that if we unnecessarily alienate religious people, and I don't want to say alienate the religious right by all means, but not all religious people are on the far right. Okay.
Well, let me give you an example and see what do you think in the public schools that we should let religion in a little more? I'm not talking about the new, the other grifter schools. I'm talking about the real public schools. Should they be able to have, should they be able to have Bible schools and pray by the polls? And have we been too critical of that, do you think?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I mean, look, I haven't really thought this one through. It's not my ballywick. It's not my biggest source of concern. I mean, I could imagine if it weren't such a heated debate, yeah, maybe they could do it after hours. They sure as hell shouldn't be doing it when all the other students are there. Absolutely not. But I don't even know if I really believe that it would be a good idea to let them in at all. I think that, what you mentioned, the grifter schools, I like that terminology. This privatization in education, that was all founded, I referenced Nancy MacLean's book, Democracy in Chains. She does a beautiful job in that book explaining how the whole charter school movement began in the 50s as an attempt to overcome desegregation, to get white kids out of desegregated schools. And it's shocking because that has been part of our national debate as long as I can remember. I remember my father talking about that with one of his friends when I was a kid. And, I was trying to understand what it was, and it seemed like a bad idea to me then. It seems like a very bad idea to me now. And yet it's taken hold. And the weird thing is now that it's taken hold, the people that seem to be benefiting from that seem to be supporting it the most are often poor people in underserved communities. And so now it's gotten to be entrenched in a way which I think is terrible. I mean, I think everyone ought to undergo a common public education. I mean, I believe in that. I think that's one of the things that shaped this country. It's one of the things that made it strong. It produced precisely this sense of community and shared identity that is lacking today. And yet, we have all these weird, ancillary systems that have grown up over the last 50 years in conjunction with neoliberalism, that it's a kind of as a flowering of those policies that have to some degree some of them have taken hold, and it's going to be really hard to eradicate them. I don't think the wise political thing to do is set about to immediately eradicate them. It's to propose a better solution and explain why it's better. I mean, I think I would agree with David on that. And I just think that we don't have any, the Democrats don't have any good leaders proposing that, proposing good solutions right now. I mean, I think, I don't think Biden's doing a terrible job. A lot of people say, oh my God, he's old, he's terrible. I just don't think he can do a whole lot. And I think he's doing the best he can under the circumstances. And I'm terrified at the prospect of Trump being reelected. Because if he is, he's the gloves are off. He's going to do whatever the hell he wants. And I think it's a real threat to our democracy, or potentially a terrible threat to our democracy. I'm hoping that these indictments will lead to convictions and that will disqualify him.
Clearly.
Well, on that note, let me ask you one last question, Erich. And I very much appreciate your time, your wisdom, your insights, your conversation, and everything that you've had to say to us. But I'm actually interested in who do you suggest that we listen, read, and learn more about relative to the philosophers of today? You talk about Plato and Socrates and Hobbes and Locke, but who is out there today that matches their wisdom that you would suggest? You separate, take yourself out of that mix. But other than that, who would you suggest that we pay attention to?
I mean, that's really tough. I spend my time mining the wisdom of Plato and Shakespeare. So I don't, that's a tough question. No, I think it works for me. It teaches me a lot, and I see a lot. I've learned a lot from doing precisely that. I think two of the people I quoted are very interesting. Michael Sandel is very good. He's got some very interesting, his book, he's got a book I think it's entitled What Money Can't Buy. It's some of the stuff I was saying is repeating points that he makes. Charles Taylor is a very interesting political philosopher. I think he might have passed on recently, but his work is really interesting. He kind of takes focus on this sort of rhetorical character, this ideological debate, and tries to sort of unravel it and show the presuppositions behind it. And I think that's really what we have to do. I think that too many people take things for granted, this sort of like Ayn Rand neolibertarian or neoliberal libertarian philosophy that people just assume is the only way to go. And it's incredibly thoughtless, I find. So I can't really answer your question, Ken. That's a good one. I'll try to think about that one and see if I can.
That's fine.
Come up with something.
You said you didn't say Mike Lindell.
No. What? No.
The pillow guy.
That's my pillow guy. I certainly did not. What gave you that thought?
I just want to be clear. My hearing's not so good any longer. So you said
you must be sleeping on the wrong kind of pillow.
Yeah, I think so. Right. Just repeat that name one more time.
Charles Taylor.
Charles Taylor, and the other one?
Michael Sandel.
Sandel. All right. Very good. All right. Well, Erich, thank you very much. We're actually out of time. I don't want to keep you beyond the time we asked you to speak with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We asked you for 2 hours, and you gave us 2 hours and a bit more, and I appreciate that very much. And I appreciate everybody who had a comment. I really want to make this an opportunity to say thank you for all. You can unmute your mics and all that. But Swami, you got your hand up or a thumbs up? It's a thumbs up, I see. Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Erich. Hope to see you soon. And by the way, a reminder, this Saturday at Miller's Ale House, if this depressed you, come have a beer and some chit chat at Miller's Ale House at Hodges and Beach Boulevard Saturday night, 6:30 p.m. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much. Love you all.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all. It's a pleasure.